We've talked about managing our own emotions as adults, but how do we know how our children are coping and how we can help them manage their feelings about what has happened in the world over the last few months? There are no doubt some worries and anxieties about COVID-19 and what will happen as we start to lift physical distancing measures. Today we have parenting and family psychology expert and founder of the Triple P Positive Parenting Program, Professor Matt Sanders, and childhood anxiety expert, Associate Professor Vanessa Cobban, with us to share some great tips for helping children cope with these uncertain times.
I have primary school kids who are missing their friendship groups and school routines. How can I support them to manage their feelings of loss in a more healthy kind of way?
My daughter keeps asking me about the coronavirus statistics, especially for older people. She's worried what will happen to her grandparents. What should I tell her?
What should I look out for to reassure me that my teenage boys are coping with this sudden and dramatic change in their worlds?
I wonder how this is affecting the kids. They seem okay, but I know they're worried. They've never been through anything like this before. I think they're concerned about getting sick or that we'll get sick.
I think for a lot of parents, this lockdown period has led many of us to actually be much more worried than we ever thought we would about how our kids are coping, and particularly about their anxiety. After all, they've experienced lots of disruptions to their lives. Their daily routines are very different, where they go each day, the disruption to their schooling and the regular contact they have with friends. Many children are also exposed to lots of different media coverage around COVID-19, and they really do notice how parents are dealing with it themselves and their parents' own distress. So when we're tuning into our kids, I think it's important to remember that children express anxiety in lots of different ways. So you can see some children becoming increasingly irritable and angry, whereas other kids will actually tell us what they're worried about and they're feeling anxious about things. With other children, particularly younger children, they may become much more clingy than they have been for ages and actually start to worry about being away from us, where we are. And then other children can become quite withdrawn, and so they're not interacting in their normal way with their brothers and sisters or with us as parents. It can also lead some kids to be just more impatient and irritable, so that they're not as tolerant of their siblings. So what do you get? You get increased arguments and sibling conflict. And then what about those children who show their anxiety because they're now wanting to come and sleep in the parents' bed or in the parents' room again? And then other kids who are involved in schoolwork just are saying they can't concentrate, they can't pay attention to what it is they need to do. So when we think about, as parents, dealing with our children's anxiety, it's important that we make ourselves available. And this means that when our kids are ready to talk, we're ready to listen. And our aim really is to try to understand where they're at, what they're concerned about. This means stopping what you're doing, tuning into your kids and listening carefully without judgment, because your goal is really to help clarify what it is your child is concerned about. Making sure that your child knows you're ready to listen to their concerns and answer any questions they may have in a simple and developmentally appropriate way. Let your child know that their feelings are normal in this highly unusual situation. Your child's worries are real to them and they're important. Even if you can't necessarily relate exactly to why the child is worried about things, you can convey ideas like, this sounds really hard for you. I get how you're feeling about this. And this goes a long way to conveying to your child that you've heard what they've said and you're trying to understand why they're concerned about it. One thing that I would really recommend is avoid telling children how they should be feeling. Try to avoid things like saying, look, you shouldn't worry about that, because it can come across as really dismissive, as though that you don't really care about how they're experiencing the situation. Now, once you've understood the worry or the concern that the child has, you're in a much better position to be able to assist the child move forward and try to figure out a way of confronting it.
kids are going back to school soon, and they're actually a bit worried about facing all the friendship groups and all the social challenges that brings. I'm worried too, because I won't be there to help them.
How can I help my kids in the long term come out the other side of this with good confidence in themselves?
I know my daughter gets anxious. She worries a lot, all the time. I just want to protect her.
I think it's hard for parents to see their children becoming distressed. When our kids are showing us that they're really anxious, our instinctive response is to try to take their worry away, to step in and take over and actually solve the problem for them. In the short term, this can work, but parents who get used to stepping in and solving the problem for the child, it doesn't help children learn to solve the problems for themselves. Vanessa, you've had a lot of time in your career helping kids and parents manage anxiety. And this idea of parents stepping in and solving the problem to protect children from ever feeling anxious isn't really helpful in the long run, is it?
You're exactly right, Matt. Although it does seem a little bit counterintuitive, solving children's problems for them is ultimately actually not a helpful thing to do. Because the thing is, each time as parents we do this, what our children are learning is, I need mum or dad to be able to deal with this situation. What they're missing out on learning is how to solve future problems for themselves. And although it's harder for us as parents in the short term, the long-term payoffs of helping children learn how to solve their own problems really are worth it. Part of helping children learn how to solve their own problems is teaching them about flexible thinking.
I think this idea of flexible thinking is a really important one. Perhaps if you could just explain that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. Adults and children alike tend to treat the thoughts we have as facts that are true. And this is important because the way we think about or the way we make sense of the things that happen in our lives plays a huge role in determining how we feel and then how we respond to those things. Imagine, for example, that we've got a child who's returning to school tomorrow after a number of weeks away. Like many children, they maybe didn't complete every single one of the home learning tasks set for their class. Now, if this child is thinking to themselves, oh no, I haven't kept up with the work and I'll be behind everyone else, there's a pretty good chance that they might be feeling anxious about this particular aspect of returning to school. On the other hand, if they're thinking to themselves, well, yeah, I haven't kept up with the work, but probably other kids are the same, then probably that child is feeling okay. As parents, we can help children learn to pay attention to what they're thinking in the situations where they feel anxious or worried. We can help them to understand that there is always more than one way to make sense of any given situation or event, and we can practice developing this kind of mental flexibility with them. For instance, as a parent, you might take the hypothetical example of David, who walks into the school playground and sees a group of kids from his class laughing together. You can ask your child, in fact, you can ask all of your kids to be part of this activity, to make up as many explanations or ways of thinking about David's situation as possible. So some of the ways of thinking about this situation might include, those guys look glad to be back at school, or I wonder what the joke is, or they're laughing at me. Once your child understands what flexible thinking is and why it matters, that is, how it affects our emotions, then you can encourage them to apply it to their own situations and feelings. Being able to think flexibly and realistically about the things that happen to us is a really great life skill, and one that both parents and children alike are going to benefit from.
My child is actually afraid to leave the house after so long at home, and all the media stories about the second wave of coronavirus. School goes back soon. Where do we even start?
So our instinctive response as a parent is often to protect our children from danger and distress. And in lots of situations this is helpful, but it can certainly backfire in the long run because it means that our kids are actually learning to avoid issues that they're concerned about rather than facing up to their fears, solving problems and becoming more resilient as they demonstrate to themselves that they can deal with what's in front of them. So when it comes to anxiety, we might almost always find running alongside of anxiety is this tendency to want to avoid situations that make you anxious, and they fuel each other, the anxiety and the avoidance. When a situation makes us anxious, and we try and avoid it or to get out of the situation as quickly as we can, this avoidance actually increases our anxiety in the future, because every time we avoid something, it makes us anxious. It confirms our belief that the situation is too difficult to handle, and we miss out on the chance of learning that we can manage it, that we can cope with it, we can actually deal with it. Vanessa, any reflections on this issue?
I think, Matt, that like you said, it is really very instinctive for us as parents to want to do whatever we can to protect our children from distress and to try and solve their problems. But as parents, particularly when our kids are anxious, one of the most important, but often, as we've been talking about, most difficult things we can do in terms of helping them to manage their anxiety is to actually encourage them to face up to their fears, but in a gradual way. So, for example, if we have a child who, after a number of weeks at home, is now highly anxious about going out and refusing, in fact, to leave the house, one of the things that we could do is we could have the parent and the child work together to develop a fear ladder with steps that are going to get the child from where they currently are, namely refusing to leave the house at all, to where they need to be, being ready to go out, especially when it's time to return to school. Now, of course, the number of steps and the amount of time spent on each step are going to depend on how significant the child's anxiety is. One child might be able to start on the step of going for a drive in the car. The next day, they might be ready to try the next step of going for a walk around the neighbourhood. And as they move up the ladder, their sense of mastery and competence is going to increase. And by the end of the week, they might be ready to visit a friend or return to school. I guess one thing we need to remember about this, though, is that by definition, what we're asking kids to do is things that they find hardest, the things they find most anxiety-provoking. And so another useful tip when we're asking kids to face up to their fears is to try and link that to rewards, praise, and perhaps more concrete rewards as well. So things like being able to choose the home-cooked meal that the family has for dinner that night.
So the idea of really focusing on encouraging kids to confront things, but in a gradual way, step by step. I suppose in that sort of situation, there's probably no role for parents becoming angry, impatient, or exploding with their kids, is there?
It's really about rewarding for effort rather than the speed at which the child gets to the top of their fear ladder.
So children are deriving strength from knowing that they have an adult who has confidence in their capacity to confront what's in front of them and to encourage them to do so.
Exactly.
That's all we have time for in today's episode of Parenting in a Pandemic. Let's just revisit Matt and Vanessa's key tips for building your child's resilience and coping skills. Tip number 1, listen to your child so you can develop an understanding of what is going on for them. Tip number 2, rather than always jumping in to save the day, it's better to help children learn to solve their own problems. Tip number 3, an important part of this is to encourage flexible thinking. There is always more than one way to interpret or make sense of situations. And tip number 4, help your child develop steps to gradually face up to their fears and realise they can do it. Thanks for listening to Parenting in a Pandemic. If you're enjoying this podcast, make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave a review. It'll help others find this series. You can find free COVID-19 Parenting in a Pandemic resources in the episode show notes to help you on this journey.